Hey, so one of the topics brought up yesterday was gun control. I've been meaning to make this video for a while. Uh, Not only is the average citizen not informed with gun control, but believe it or not, the average member of the uniformed services and the average member of Congress is also uninformed when it comes to gun control. And so here's the situation. The common argument from the Democrats is, you know, okay, we're not going to ban all guns, but we don't need assault weapons. We don't need weapons of war. Like, if the Constitution even allows private citizens to have weapons, which we do not think it does, the idea of having weapons to fight government tyranny is taken care of by the existence of the National Guard. And the Republican argument is, no, the National Guard is not what the militia is as defined in the Constitution. And you need to understand that if the federal government has all means of actual true war-making weapons, then there is no way for the states to stand up and revolt if a need should ever arise. And so the Democratic argument as a rebuttal is, but kids are dying, but mass shootings are happening. Surely you care about the people. It's the NRA in your pockets. That's the only reason why you're arguing that you want to protect against government tyranny. And in this conversation, in this situation, I fall squarely in the Republican aisle. The fact of the matter, there's two big points that people don't understand that they need to understand to make sense of the gun control argument. The first is the NRA does not contribute anywhere near as much money to campaigns as people say they do. I actually probably should have did a screen share. It's crazy how much their contributions pale in comparison to other organizations that contribute to Democrats, even though Democrats claim to be unbiased as well. So I don't really believe at all that the NRA sways electoral opinion as much as Democrats are arguing for argument's sake. But the real conversation here, the real thing that people don't understand is the definition of the Constitution, the way the Constitution is written, right? For the right to bear arms. I'm gonna read this back to you because people don't understand. People don't understand what the Second Amendment actually means, right? So it's pretty straightforward, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to bear arms, bear arms shall not be infringed, right? And so basically what Democrats are doing is they're saying, well, it says well-regulated militia, that's the National Guard in the discussion. Regular citizens don't need to keep and bear arms. So here's something people don't understand about the National Guard. As a guardsman, I understand this because I like to research what I do before I do it. So I understand how the reserve works, I understand how active duty works, and I understand how the Guard works in terms of what they were federally created to do, right? And so, yes, it is true, as well documented in the history books, that the National Guard started originally as the original state militias. And yes, it is true that back then, the state militias performed the role as expressed in the Constitution. What people don't understand is that the states signed an agreement with the federal government over their militias and federalized the militias, thus creating the National Guard. It creates a duality of powers. It puts the guardsmen in a unique position, unlike the reserves and especially the active duty, where they have a dual allegiance at most times until the federal government signs off on a pen or basically pushes a button and says, your allegiance now belongs to me. And people don't understand this, right? But there's, so basically, when you are a military service member, be it the Guard or the Reserves, and you are called to duty somewhere, you're considered being put on orders, right? And this is not like your normal drill weekend. That's called M-Day. But when you're actually called to duty, so you are activated as a soldier, you're put on orders. What people don't understand is that if you're in a reserve, the only people that can call you to orders is the federal government. So your entire time in the reserves, you are a complete uniformed services, earning points, like knocking it out. You only have one allegiance, that is to the federal government. But when you are a guardsman, you can be put on orders to serve the state orders, or you can be put on orders to serve the federal government, federal orders. And these two orders are separate. They come from separate pots of money, and they have separate powers. So the state can call you up for national disaster type stuff, hurricane relief, et cetera, right? The federal government does not have the power to activate you for that type of stuff. But the federal government can activate you for a deployment or a training so that you keep up your knowledge, skills, and abilities in awareness with the rest of the armed forces. That duality, though, also grants the federal government the power to trump state orders. So what that means is that the government of your state, if you're in the National Guard, can say, hey, Sergeant Scott, you have been activated to serve in hurricane relief X, Y, and Z with unit X, Y, and Z. And the federal government can say, wait, Sergeant Scott, we rescind those orders. We need you to serve in Afghanistan. And the states just got to toss up their hands. There's nothing they can do, right? And there are actually cases of states deciding that it might be best for a Guard unit to do some type of state-based function, and the federal government saying, no, we have a deployment plan that we're doing. This unit's going to go overseas, right? So the debates last night did point out that half of the units deployed overseas were National Guard units. But what they didn't point out during the gun control part of the debate was that because these National Guard units are federalized, by the definition of the Constitution, they are not the militia anymore. And that changes the entire gun control conversation completely, because the entire argument of the Democratic Party at this point is that private citizens don't need to own a gun because we have the Army, the National Guard, and law enforcement. You don't have a need. The National Guard can protect you from government tyranny, right? But the fact of the matter is that each state actually does actively maintain a militia, completely separate from the National Guard. But it's not called the militia because, modern times. So what you need to do is you need to take your state, wherever you're watching this at, and Google your state space defense force. No bullshit. Maryland Defense Force, California Defense Force, whatever, right? Maybe the name changes subtly, and the title name changes subtly, but you will find that your state has a militia, a well-regulated militia full of private citizens. You cannot be a soldier in the Army Reserve, the National Guard, or active duty and be a member of the militia. However, they almost exclusively recruit former soldiers in order to be a well-regulated militia. So like the commander of the Maryland Defense Force is a retired field grade officer or a discharged field grade officer, depending on who they pick. The idea being, and then that leader of the Maryland Defense Force actually coordinates, liaises, and falls under for the purposes of peacetime training and coordination and disaster recovery relief efforts and all that stuff with the head of the National Guard for that state. So that dynamic is not only important to understand, but it's important to illustrate in the gun debate, because you're talking about taking away assault weapons, which actually aren't technically definable. And I hate that some people who are in the military use that term. You're talking about taking away rifles, weapons, semi-automatic weapons, whatever, from the hands of citizens in order to prevent citizens from going crazy. But you're completely ignoring the fact that the militia members are citizens. When the state of Maryland banned the use of automatic weapons, we had to put, the Maryland Guard and the Maryland Defense Force had to put little stock locks on the weapons so that you couldn't switch to 3-round burst. These are the laws that get passed without consideration to how national defense is run, how state level defense is run. And we have to be very careful when we talk in absolutes about how no private citizen needs a weapon, because any private citizen could be called upon to serve in the state defense force and serve and defend and protect the state and not be subject to federal funding, and therefore not technically be a National Guards member or active duty soldier. So hopefully that gave you some enlightenment. I encourage you to Google Defense Force. I know about the Maryland Defense Force specifically. I've seen the Virginia National Guard Defense Force members. I've seen West Virginia Defense Force members. And it's because when I was in the Guard, I was in the reserves in the Guard, and I was also called to active duty. So when I was in the Guard, we actually had a armory where we shared space with the Maryland Defense Force, and I had no idea what they were. I never heard of them. I didn't know what they did. Their uniforms looked weird. I didn't understand what's going on, and nobody could really explain it. None of my senior leadership could explain it. So it was some Google searching and then just randomly stopping Defense Force citizen soldiers, and asking them hey, who the hell are you? So you need to understand, basically, as a summary, and then I'll wrap it up, that there is a history of the National Guard and the militia, right? And so for a while, the history of the National Guard and militia was one line. At a point, the federal government steps in and federalizes the militias of the states, and it creates two lines that now exist separately and move forward. One line being the National Guard and one line being the Maryland Defense Force, or the defense force of your state. All right, guys, peace out.